Please be seated. The court is now back in session. And once again, the floor is given to Kears and Pond's defense to continue putting further questions to the expert. And defense counsel for Kears and Pond, please wait. And Counsel Coupe, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Very quick question. Just for you to confirm that next witness is TCCP 303. Is that correct? Because there's some confusion on this side of the room.
President, the civil party through TCCP 303 will appear next. President and Defense Counsel Antagouche, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good afternoon, Ms. Becker. Before I continue on your interview with Pol Pot specifically, I would like to read an excerpt from a document that was placed on the interface by the co-prosecutors, and which is a report, a FIBIS report, which you already spoke about, which was relating news in Cambodia. And this is document E3/295. And unfortunately, I think there's only an English version, so you're going to have to suffer my accent. But the ERN number is 00169-145. So it's the first paragraph, and I'm going to read it out in English.
20 December, the British professor and US journalists visited the refugee camp of our fraternal Kampuchea Krom Khmers at Kampeng. They listened with interest to the accounts of savage treatment, persecution, massacres, and extermination raids committed by the Vietnamese enemy against our Kampuchea Krom brothers taking refuge in Kampuchea. Fin de citation.
End of quote. So my question is the following. Did you indeed visit a camp in Kampeng on 20 December? Do you remember this visit?
Yes.
And did you speak with refugees in this camp?
Yes, with a few.
Est-ce que
And do you remember what they told you with regard to the treatment that these refugees might have endured on the part of the Vietnamese?
Largely, if I remember correctly, there are a couple of things. One, they said they'd come to Cambodia for food, and two, to earn a living, make money. In particular, we did not have a lot of time there. It was rushed, but that's, yes. Those are the two things I remember, the food and then making a living.
donc vous
You don't remember if they were treated in any special way, any details, or you did not have the time to ask for the detail about the treatment they were subjected to, or maybe you don't remember?
On the ride over, we were told things by our, I think it was Persit, but when we actually got there, we did not have a lot of time. So when we talked to them, this is what they mostly talked about, that I remember. And I remember that the conditions of the camp were different from the conditions of a co-op. I wish I could remember in better detail, but it's been decades.
Pas de souci.
No problem if you don't remember. Another point of clarification which I forgot to ask you about this morning with regard to your book again, E3/20 therefore, and for you it's page 170, French ERN 00638 439, English ERN 00237875, and Khmer, it's 2 pages, 00232227, and it goes to 228. And here you mention figures, and you speak about the war between the Lon Nol side and the Khmer Rouge. And you say, and I quote, officially, the war caused 500,000 dead in the Lon Nol side, as well as hundreds of thousands of wounded. End of quote, free translation. My question also, as with my question with regard to the number of hectares that were destroyed, where do you draw these figures from? Where did you get these figures, if you can remember?
Ok, je vous remercie pour cette précision.
Thank you for this clarification. Now I would like to turn to your interview with Pol Pot in 1978. And I understood from your testimony over the past 2 days that that into the very last moment you were not sure that you were going to meet him, but I didn't understand very well if he was if it was the same situation with him as with the others, that you were only going to be told at the last moment, or that you had been told that you were going to meet him, but that you didn't exactly know when. So the meeting with Pol Pot, was this a surprise, or was this something that had been announced to you before and that actually happened despite your fears that you might not be able to conduct this interview?
No, this was different from all the others. The others, we were told in advance and we were prepared. But with Pol Pot, they said they could not promise us at all. And every day we would wake up and ask. So there's no question this was different.
And in the article which we spoke about earlier, your article of September 1977, in which you spoke about the quest for respectability, or in any case, I think that's the meaning that you tried to convey. In any case, a desire to open up a little bit. So did you analyze Pol Pot's desire to meet with you as an aspect of his desire to open up the country a little bit?
I took him sort of at his word that he met with us in order to talk about the coming war and with Vietnam, very much so. It was from Mr. Yang Suri that we were told about the opening up, but Mr. Pol Pot did not mention that with us.
Well, it's sure that when you are speaking with him, and of course you only have the information that was given to you by the State Department, so you do not imagine, of course, that the attack was imminent. But when you look in retrospect, when you left and when you learned that Vietnam had attacked Cambodia 2 days after your departure, aside from the ideas with the issues of the Warsaw Pact, etc. But with regard to the imminence of the war with Vietnam, wasn't Pol Pot a bit more informed than the other people you had spoken to before with regard to the upcoming Vietnamese attack?
I'll have to say you just misrepresented what I said. I had a lot of information. You asked me why I went to the State Department for a briefing, and it's a normal thing an American citizen would do, a more American journalist would do before she leaves. I had a lot of information, and I had read all the information, so we knew it was imminent. And simply the fact, as I said earlier, that Yen Suri had asked the UN Secretary General to come to Cambodia. And when he said no, he invited us. It was quite clear that they knew that a war was happening. As I said repeatedly, it's a question of how severe, and that's where I went and talked to everybody, including the State Department and others you mentioned. But that was not all I knew.
So, when you had this interview with Pol Pot, you were not surprised that Vietnam became the central point of the discussion, or in any case of his presentation?
It had been the central point through most of the trip, including that trip to the crocodile tanks.
I'm going to now specifically. I don't think I've given the ERNs yet, but it's again your document E320, and it's on page 425. In English, 00238 In French, it is 00638 674, and in Khmer, 232 560, and it continues on to the following page. And you are on this page. You mentioned the fact that he is referring to his fear of the Vietnamese attack, and he repeated himself regularly. Vietnam wanted to swallow up Kampuchea and make it a satellite in a Vietnamese-controlled Indochina Federation. To that end, Pol Pot said, Vietnam had become a satellite of the Soviet Union. Vietnam went and kissed the feet of the Soviet Union and made a military alliance with the Soviet Union. This was proof for Pol Pot that Vietnam wanted to internationalize the dispute between the two countries. End of quote. So here, I'm not going to be talking about the problems with the Warsaw Pact, but once again, within the context of the Cold War and the alliances we spoke about this morning, does this part of his statement seem to you completely bizarre, or did it make sense given the alliance between Vietnam and the Soviet Union, and which maybe allowed Vietnam to feel freer to do certain things, in particular attacking Cambodia, for example?
I'll repeat. The Sino-Soviet split was critical to this war. So obviously I don't think this is bizarre.
Je reviendrai ensuite.
I will revisit the discussions that you might have had later on with Yang Sari, but I would like to revisit briefly the death of Professor Caldwell. I won't go into certain details. I simply want to revisit the relation, the report, corrects the interpreter, that Dudman wrote and submit to you certain excerpts of this report for you to comment on them. So this is document E3/3290. I believe that you do not have it with you right now, but I'm going to ask the President's leave for the court officer to give you a copy of this document. And what I really want to focus on is on the last page.
Yes, you can do so.
Donc le RN.
So the English ERN, it's the last page. Maybe not the last page because it is 00419-212. And a priori, there's only an English version. So once again, I'm going to quote in English. First of all, before I quote from this document, I'm going to remind you of the context. This is therefore after Caldwell's death. Chun Prasit therefore goes to find Dudman in his room. So I will start quoting in.
At 3:45 a.m., one of the government's Mercedes-Benz limousines pulled in front of the house. A figure got out and walked quickly into the house and up the stairs. There was another rap at my door. It was Chun Prasit, the senior foreign ministry official who was in charge of our visit. The usually dapper man looked stricken and bone-tired. He took me by the hand and led me to a couple of chairs. Miss Baker is all right, but Mr. Caldwell is dead, he said. I think you must come and see. Fin de citation.
End of quote.
Ma première question.
My first question is, do you remember the reaction after you saw Chun Prasit? Is Dudman's description in the report does it correspond to what you noticed with Chun Prasit, that he was more troubled than normally, that he really seemed to be disturbed?
We were all very disturbed.
A bit further down in this report, Dudman explains Prasit's explanations on that day, and I'm going to quote again in English.
Prasit described the shooting as a political act to discredit us in the world and to show that we cannot protect our friends. He said the terrorists knew that the visit of the first 3 Westerns to Cambodia was a significant one, and that Cambodia's reputation in the world would be greatly damaged if they were assassinated. Only days later, that Cambodia regime would be driven into hiding by a Vietnamese assault. Fin de citation.
End of quote. I will continue with the 2 last paragraphs in the report, and then I will ask my question after. So again, I will quote in English.
Dernier paragraphe.
The 2 last paragraphs, therefore, of that page.
Finally, was there any possibility that the government could have arranged the attack? a dispatch from Hanoi later reported that Caldwell had recently turned against Cambodia and conjectured that the government may have wanted to prevent what they feared would be an adverse report. This seems out of the question. The Cambodian government had everything to lose from the incident. If for some uncountable reason the authorities had wanted us killed, they could have contrived an accident or ambush to kill us all. And from lengthy conversation with Caldwell up to a few hours of his death, I know that he remained fully sympathetic to the Cambodian revolution. Fin de citation.
End of quote. So, what I understand from this report is what you said during the past 2 days. That is to say that Caldwell was always sympathetic and enthusiastic about the Cambodian revolution, and you said, and let me get back to your terms in your book, I think you say for your translation that he was delighted by his interview with Pol Pot, during which he was able to speak about economic issues, which were his specialty. Now, with regard to what Dudman says, regarding Caldwell, does that correspond to the discussions that you might have had with him afterwards?
Yes, and as I wrote in the book, I was the last one to speak with him, and he said that Cambodia reminded him of Scotland, and Vietnam would be England. So that's the way he put it. And he remained sympathetic to Democratic Kampuchea, no question.
You already said that if you were obliged to provide an answer, one of the possibilities would be that it was someone within Democratic Kampuchea who did not favor this desire to open up from Ieng Sary that might have been behind this assassination. So I don't know if you have read the book by Philip Short, Pol Pot, The History of a Nightmare. With regard to this incident, he speaks about the different ideas that were given concerning this incident, and this is what he says. This is document E3/9. The French ERN is 00639-970, and in English it is 00396-602, and unfortunately there is no Khmer translation. I don't think there is one. In this excerpt, he brings up different propositions, and he says, and this is what Philip Short says, he says that the most believable version, which the regime refused to give credit to, was that a Vietnamese commando was behind the attack. No one had a stronger interest, the Vietnamese, to demonstrate the incompetence of the Vietnamese. Nobody was better placed than the Vietnamese to do so. In any case, the main lesson we can draw from Malcolm Caldwell's death was that in December 1978, there was no longer any guaranteed security in Phnom Penh. End of quote, free translation. maybe I should repeat the last sentence because apparently I went too fast. Regardless, the main lesson we can draw from Malcolm Caldwell's death was that in December 1978, security was no longer guaranteed in Phnom Penh. And my question is, have you ever heard this possibility of an assassination that had been ordered by Vietnam? Is this among the ideas that you might have heard later on?
As I said, Ieng Sary said that at the secular ceremony for Malcolm's death. He blamed the Vietnamese.
Justement, à propos de...
Precisely regarding Ieng Sary, together with the international co-prosecutor, you referred to his interview in 1980, after your meeting in 1978, and he revisited the issue of that visit. And since what had been said was not quoted in its entirety, I will ask you to clarify what exactly was said. The ERN for the document I would like you to look at is 00602000.
Je suis désolée,
I'm sorry. I forgot to note the ERNs in the other languages, so I will read it out very slowly, pending whenever it will be found, or whenever those ERNs can be ascertained.
I could assist if counsel would like. I believe the ERNs for the French, you said it was 0602000. Then the equivalent in English, in Khmer, is 00578-895, and in English, 00342-501-502.
Je remercie, Monsieur.
Thank you, co-prosecutor, for your assistance. May I request that this page in English be printed out so that we may use it subsequently?
Simplement, avant de... pour ne pas perdre de temps sur...
Before we dwell on the circumstances of that interview, can you please tell us how you met with Mr. Ieng Sary that day and how that interview was arranged? Was it a face-to-face interview? Were you alone or you were with other journalists?
This is 1980 or 1981?
C'est ça, c'est 1980.
The 22nd of July, 1980.
Désolée pour ce cafouillage, vous l'avez.
I am sorry about this mixed-up.
C'est la question sur...
I believe it was face-to-face, yeah. Yeah, and it was, this would have had to be in New York.
Je vous remercie de cette précision.
Thank you for this clarification. The passage that I find relevant, particularly, is the one about the vote in 1977 regarding Malaysia.
C'est bon, vous y êtes?
Have you found it?
Donc, il parle.
So he's talking about that period, and this is what he says. At the time, people in Cambodia were saying that we could win because Pol Pot believed that we could win. And then in parentheses, I think this is your remark, he mentions my trip with Malcolm Caldwell and Richard Dutman. End of parentheses. Yes, I was worried then. I was very worried. The internal problem was very complicated. When I came back from a trip abroad in the fall of 1978, the problem was very important. The fear for me was a coup d'etat inside, not the threat of an invasion from the outside. I don't know who would make the coup. End of quote.
Ma première question.
My first question is as follows.
Vous avez entendu, vous m'entendez, il n'y a pas de problème?
Can you follow me? No problem. My first question on the passage I've just read out to you is as follows. Again, after the fact, when you review that visit after the fact, in 1978, did you feel that Ieng Sary was worried at that time in light of the exchanges or the interviews you had with him and even before?
He said that he was worried about Vietnam. He did not say anything about internal security.
Lorsque vous le voyez, donc,
When you met with him in 1980 and you discussed the internal problems as part of the research you carried out or research you carried out on democratic Cambodia, did you come across any documents or testimonies that referred to attempts to assassinate Pol Pot and other leaders, or any attempted coup d'etat before 1978? Was that something you came across or read in the course of your research?
President, expert, please hold on. International Co-Prosecutor, you may proceed.
Your Honor, just a very small clarification of the record. I hear counsel in this question and previously reading the document as being dated 1980, while in the English version that I have, the document is dated on each page and at the front 22 July 1981, and the interview we're discussing is 1981 according to the English version.
alors je pense que ça va être une question de traduction.
It may well be a translation problem, because I indeed said 1981, and that was confirmed by the expert. Now, to return to my question, would you like me to repeat the question? My question.
Yes, very often in tool slang confessions. But the problem here is that, and people were killed because they were accused of attempted plots, so on and so forth. But the problem here is that that's the only place. There was no legal system in Cambodia so that where there's a jurisprudence where someone would be tried either in a military court or a criminal court and said, this is our evidence, here's the judge or jury, you're convicted, here's the death penalty. None of that existed. So it's impossible to measure the accuracy of these accusations because people were brought in, their friends, their families, and killed because of accusations without any body of evidence. So that's what you come across when you do the research.
Donc vous n'avez jamais eu d'entre...
So you never had any interviews with anyone during which you may have obtained confirmation of attempted coup d'etats or attempts to overthrow the government, or any attempts on the life of Pol Pot and other persons. I am talking of testimonies outside of any documentary research you may have carried out.
I believe, off the top of my head, certainly I remember, it may even be in the Ying Tarit interview, and certainly there was mention of that, but there was no document, there was nothing serious other than someone saying this or that or the other, but nothing that would in any way match the seriousness of saying there was an attempted coup d'etat.
Et sur les questions...
And as regards the issue of power vacuum, did you have the impression in the course of your research and interviews, any information referring to internal struggles in democratic Cambodia, where we are talking of the Standing Committee or any other organs of the democratic Cambodia regime?
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, and that's part of the tension between the center and the regions, and it's a drama that's played out all through those records.
Et est-ce qu'il y avait...
And were there tensions between the regions outside of the central region?
At times, yes.
Sur ce point, je voudrais...
On this point, I would like to refer you to your book, E320. In French, the ERN is 00638-523. In English, it is 00237968, and in Khmer 00232348.
Je suis désolée, je n'ai plus le numéro de...
I'm sorry, I don't have the page number. I only have the ERN numbers. 263, I am told by a member of my team. This is the passage I will refer to you. Let me quote it. There were power problems, however. There was a little fight on the streets of Phnom Penh opposing soldiers from the east and soldiers from the north. End of quote. First question. What are the sources for this incident? And if you have such sources, what was the cause of this clash between the north zone and the east zone?
Excuse me, I didn't find it on that page. Could you repeat? What year are we talking?
A priori, le numéro qu'on m'avait donné, c'est la page 263.
It is on page 263. It may be a problem with the edition because I know that sometimes there are differences. If we may ask the court officer, perhaps you can give the expert my edition of the book.
The President, court officer, please take the document from the defense counsel and hand it over to the expert. President, no, the expert has the document, so...
Very well then. So you have found the passage. It may have been a problem with the translation in French. If you have found the passage, please tell us of that incident. What were the sources and what was the cause of that incident?
I was confused because you said north and east, and I didn't say the zones in this sentence. I'm afraid my memory is not that good, and I could guess, but I'm not so sure it would be great. In the beginning, the only thing that I can reference is that when you, in the evacuation and the different zones, there were already some differences of how you evacuate, and there was some who controls what. And I don't remember if that was an extension of this because it's only 1 year later or what. I can't remember. But this is not having to, there was a later incidents with factory workers, and I don't think this is it.
Je vais passer à un autre passage.
I will move to another passage, therefore. It's on page 204 in the English. The ERN I believe we face a problem here regarding the edition. In English, the ERN is 00237 909. In Khmer, 00232 270. And in French, it's page 204. I can't find the ERN, but it is on page 204. And in this passage, you are referring to zone secretaries, and this is what you say. Strong zone secretaries like Sofim and Tamok interpreted policies as they saw fit, and soon there was less uniformity in post-war rural Cambodia than in the days of fighting. End of quote. I will ask the questions I asked a while ago. What are your sources? Can you tell us something of the zone secretaries, Sopim and Tamok? Can you tell us how they operated?
Well, Tamok is the stronger character, and what in particular are you looking for in terms of how they operated?
En fait, c'est un peu en lien avec mes...
In fact, this has to do with my previous question. Do you remember your sources for your claim that there were internal struggles? It would be good to know how the zone secretaries function or operated, because mention was made of warlords as regards certain zone secretaries. I would like to know whether, as part of your research, what you said regarding strong zone secretaries like Sopim and Tamok is in line with what you observed as an expert.
Yes, they were strong, and that meant that they exerted certain strong controls and like a strong governor, there's the strong leader. I don't know what else to say.
Là encore, en fait...
Here again, Ms. Becker, the entire discussion has to do with the internal functioning of democratic Kampuchea and the zones, and you pointed out that even at the time of the evacuation there were major disparities, and this is again linked to what Philip Short said before this chamber, specifically that because of the power struggle there were clashes between zone secretaries. Does it have a bearing on the policies of democratic Kampuchea? And that is why I am asking you whether there was a link between these issues and whether you made certain observations or whether you studied the subject of this internal struggle in light of what Ieng Sari said and the fears he expressed. Do you find a link between all this and the internal struggle? So the main thrust of my questions and this discussion is to understand the dynamic within democratic Kampuchea in relation to the zones and relations between the various zones.
And I definitely studied it, and before and after the interview with Ieng Sari, because the greater the tension, the greater the center tried to impose the power over the zones. In fact, I remember there's somewhere in the book I talk about Nguyen Chia coming to talk about, was it the northern zone? Yeah, the northern zone, to say they were missing some recording tape, and this put the fear of being arrested because the north zone was under suspicion by the center. And these tensions were prelude to generally a purge. So the fellow this would have been Comrade Pot, and so he remembers going to this lecture where Nguyen Chia talks about the missing tape, which he considered an accident, but was characterized as a mistake, which could lead to being purged and killed. And this is one of those themes throughout, that a mistake is made, an error is made, an accident, whatever, and then the fear that the center will then start an investigation and there'll be a purge in the zone. So you're absolutely right. This is a big tension.
Et là, encore une fois, vous...
Here again, you are referring to tensions between the center and the zones. How about the zones themselves? I do not have the exact reference of the part of the book in which you refer to that, but between the zones themselves, there was an internal struggle.
Yes, and that, I think, and again, you'll have to excuse me, I think in some ways the Eastern Zone is one of the better examples of that, of where you have the evidence that the tension was not simply over power and resources, which was common. Resources were hard to get, and you wanted enough resources for the people you're taking care of. And in the Eastern Zone, it was also, I believe, a policy issue. So that's, in fact, that about how you treat people and whether or not another zone is going to be used if there's going to be a tension over those policy issues of how you treat. Remember talking about people going from co-op to co-op. And the explosion in the Eastern Zone was what preceded the flight of the cadre to Vietnam in advance of the Vietnamese invasion.
Alors justement...
Now, precisely regarding what you said about Vietnam and what had happened before, I would like to refer you to a passage in your book, 320, E320. The ERN in French is 00638 682, and the ERN in English 00238 147, and for you, Ms. Becker, It's on page 434 of your book. And the ERN in Khmer is 00232-571. And you are making a comment on the Vietnamese invasion. Finally, all the pieces had fallen into place, at least for some years to come. Vietnam, the country made famous for its saying, "Nothing is more precious than freedom and independence," was now the military lord over Cambodia. With the signing of the 25-year peace and friendship treaty between Vietnam and the government it installed in Cambodia, the rulers in Hanoi were dominant over all of Indochina, end of quote. I want to link this with what you say in the book and what prompted you to say a posteriori at the time of Pol Pot. What was said regarding certain leaders of democratic Kampuchea, the fear of annexation, the fear of occupation of Cambodia by Vietnam. Finally, what you say here tallies with what you told Council Kope yesterday regarding what the Chinese said, what Sihanouk said. Notably, that there was that fear for decades, and finally those observations don't seem to tie in.
Oh, yes, they do. That's the absolute tragedy of this situation. As I said, beginning of the war in 1970, the Vietnamese took the side and fought for the Khmer Rouge while they were getting their forces together. And then once they signed the peace accord with Washington, they gradually got out, and the Khmer Rouge took over. It's an instance where the Khmer Rouge, out of their fears in finding the Vietnamese behind every bush, eventually prompted this border war with the Vietnamese and sort of opened the door. It's like push, pull, push, pull, push, pull. Was it? I'm not of the school that this was obvious and evident and was going to happen. I think the Khmer Rouge, the DK leadership, sort of almost walked into this. So yes, the fear, you walk down the street today and there's fears about the Vietnamese. This is part of that doesn't mean that Vietnam is going to invade tomorrow. But this was an instance where they, as I say in the book, they walked into this, they particularly when internal problems that we've just discussed got worse and worse and worse. They blamed their own problems on Vietnam. And that's why I said what's really hard in sorting this out is there was no jurisprudence system there. If we'd had a military court where we could see what the evidence was that this was a Vietnamese plot or whatever, we could have a much better conversation. But this was all, we think this guy is Vietnamese, we think this guy is Vietnamese, we think this guy is you can't sort it out. There is no evidence. There's no trial record like we have here. So it's a total tragedy.
Donc après ça, que j'ai compris que c'était votre opinion que.
I take it that this is your opinion on the border dispute, and that it is Cambodia that asked for it. In light of the discussions we've had, the record of the Standing Committee, the situation was not static, and there was no desire for war initially.
Oh, yeah, I mean, the Brevet line, the Cambodians said, no, we're not going to negotiate that. But the war was not eventually over the Brevet line. It was on the land route.
Je voudrais évoquer également.
I would like us to discuss another passage from your book. And for you, it will be page 436. and it is a part in which you're talking shortly after the invasion. In French, the ERN is 00638684. In English, the ERN is 00238-148, and in Khmer 00232-573.
Non, excusez-moi, je me suis trompée sur les...
I'm sorry, I didn't give you the right ERN in English. It's page 436, and in English it's 00238-149, and in Khmer 00232-575. And this is what you state. You are talking of the period immediately after the Vietnamese invasion. The Vietnamese economy collapsed, and in late 1979, the regime instituted liberal reforms that counseled the march towards socialism imposed in 1979 to prepare the war, 1978 to prepare the war. Vietnamese children also joined the ranks of the world's most most vulnerable victims with alarming rates of malnutrition and disease. But the more Vietnam suffered, the more the leaders were convinced that Cambodia should be under their thumb and at all costs. The stakes were too high for them to envisage withdrawing. End of quote. The last part was a free translation by the interpreter. I would ask a question based on this.
Alors,
So I see that you have a comment to make regarding what I just read out to you. Yes?
You had an extra sentence about under the thumb.
alors je n'ai pas rajouté.
Well, I didn't add a sentence. That is the French version that corresponds to the editions of the second edition that were added. Personally, I didn't add anything. I can confirm that. I am speaking under, of course, Judge Lavergne and Marie Guiraud's control. They have the French copy. These are nuances that exist between the different editions. So here, I must say, I can only tell you that this is the translation of the second edition of your book. Doesn't this ring a bell to you?
Yeah, I'm reading. Except for, there's no question that everything I wrote is true. I don't. Yes, that's what I wrote.
I wanted to read out another excerpt to you and then ask you a question about the totality of all of this. Well, let me first start maybe with my first question. So in the conclusions of your work, you speak about the issue of the current regime that is supported by Vietnam, the current regime in Cambodia. And then, well, let me read to you the second excerpt. That will make things easier. So again, it's your book, so document E3/20. ERN French 00638-687. Khmer 00232653. And we're going to have the same problem as previously. That is to say that the version that you have, the English version that you have in our translation, did not include the amendments in the second edition that are in the French copy. So let me read out to you in French this passage so that it can be properly interpreted. I'll read it out slowly. In this scenario, let me start with the beginning maybe. A group of Cambodian communists led by a former cadre of the East Zone and by members of an ethnic minority reconstituted the party under the name of the People's Revolutionary Party and claimed that this was a true party that was the true party that had been founded in 1951. Pol Pot is described as an aberration whose crimes go back to 1975. In this scenario, the greatest crime of the government of Democratic Cambodia was to attack the members of the party as Hun Sen, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and he is now the Prime Minister. This is why there wasn't any destabilization or any kind of denazification in Cambodia since the invasion. The People's Republic of Cambodia believes that two criminals are essentially behind or responsible for the Holocaust, that's the word you use, Pol Pot and Ieng Sary. The Communist Party that they led is presented as a victim, not as the executioner. And the Cambodian communists continue to govern the country, but under the tutorship of Vietnam. End of quote, free translation. And in relation to these observations, or to what I read out to you, I'd like to refer you to what you said yesterday. I think it was when you answered a question from my colleague Victor Koppe. We were speaking about Heng Samrim and Hun Sen, and you said these are not former Khmer Rouge because they escaped. They escaped the purges. That's what I remember in any case. Of course, you can correct me if I didn't understand properly. So my first question is, insofar that these people, of course, are in power today, in the context of the new regime, and between 75 and 77, they had positions within the Khmer Rouge government before they escaped to Vietnam. So my question is, do you consider that these are former Khmer Rouge that they are former Khmer Rouge who are in power today, or do you make any kind of distinction with regard to their position?
Of course, I believe they are former Khmer Rouge. And what you misremembered was that your colleague said that DK wasn't overthrown because Hun Sen and Heng Samrin were DK. And I said that's a false analogy. They're former Khmer Rouge who were the front for the Vietnamese invasion and occupation. And then I made a reference to Vichy, to say that Vichy was just a different version of France. In fact, Vichy was the French face for the German occupation. So that's what I said. There's never any doubt that they're former Khmer Rouge. In fact, Kia Chun, who was my interpreter, is part of the government. I mean, that's not at issue.
D'accord, donc j'avais mal compris.
Thank you. Maybe I didn't understand properly. Thank you for this clarification. And I'm going to finish with this question. So you are speaking before this chamber as an expert and as a witness as well. And in your research, you spoke about the conversations you had with people such as Heder, Kiernan, Chandler, etc. And do you draw a distinction between the work of those who have a rather academic background, that is to say, who spent a great part of their lives studying documents from Democratic Cambodia, who speak Khmer, etc., and with your research work, but not necessarily academic which you did as a journalist. Do you draw this distinction between both? Or do you see no distinction between, let's say, academic work and your journalistic work?
I'm a journalist. I'm not an academic.
Donc, quand
So, when, well, you're certainly aware of Chandler's criticism of your work. Of course, he acknowledges the journalistic merits of this of your work, but he criticizes your method with regard to the historical part. Do you agree that you consider that you did that your work was the work of a journalist and not the work as of a researcher for your book when the war was over?
I saw that in the documents that you gave me, but there was no citation and no date. Could you please tell me where it's from?
alors ça
Well, this is an article, Requiem for the 1970s, when the war was over, written by David Chandler. This is document E3/232/1.1.5. I cannot tell you where it came out, but you have never been informed of this article? You are not aware of it?
I'm not sure about that. I was surprised to read it. I don't know when it was written or where it was published. Now, I know that David Chandler wrote to different academics asking them not to use my book because it's been used quite a bit in universities. But that one in particular, I'm not sure, and I was puzzled why there was... Is it a typescript or was it actually published? I mean, where did David Chandler give it to you?
à moi, il ne m'a rien.
He didn't give anything to me, but he probably gave it to the tribunal because these are documents that are on the case file. In any case, do we agree? Or, I'm sorry, did you ever speak to David Chandler about your book, rather?
Après leur parution, est-ce que vous avez...
After the book was published, did you have any face-to-face discussion with David Chandler?
He was very positive. And so that's why I'm wondering, is that an authentic article? I mean, it could be. I would like to know where it was published, the date.
Mon équipe.
My team, always so efficient, they tell me that it was in the China issues. The Indochina issues, I'm sorry. In 1986. It was published in this review. Well, there is some criticism with regard to your methodology, of course, but that's why I'm asking you the question. So your background as a journalist and how it differs from academics who have different, very precise methods in terms of quotations and all that, because that is at the heart of the criticism presented in David Chandler's article. I can read out the specific excerpt in which your work, he criticizes your work. This is ERN French 00852-986, English 0085-0336, and in Khmer 00852-452. And this is what he says, free translation, and this is with regard to the methodology used. Here or elsewhere, I found that the book was not thorough enough. During the book, and particularly in the sections that are supposedly historical, her ignorance of Khmer leads her to make mistakes, and although she drew very much from works of other experts to support her arguments, the names of these people sometimes disappear from her notes. Thus, Michael Vickery should have been quoted several times. in reference to pages 109, 250, 254, when Elizabeth Becker seems to paraphrase his work. I'm finishing the quote here. This is why I'm asking you if you draw a distinction between journalistic work and and academic work. You said to me that you're a journalist essentially and not an academic. So do you have anything to add to this? And otherwise, I've finished with my examination, and I will give the floor to my colleague Kong Samon, who has a few questions to put to you as well. And thank you for having taken the time to answer me.
Yes, I do have something to say. It's an unusual position to say this is a good book, but she isn't an academic. It's a very old-fashioned view, and if you look at his praise of journalists since then, he doesn't use any of those problems. Most recently, Joel Brinkley, who doesn't have anywhere near my primary resources, didn't bring any of this up. So I think he's changed his standards since then, and of all the things you picked the one. Do you want me to read what others have said about my book? I would be happy to, for the record. The definitive book on the Cambodian Revolution. Becker writes history as history should be written, a work of the first importance. I'd be happy to read more, but I'm very proud of the way this is used. It's still used it is used in universities and academics to this day. And I would ask you if you believe David Chandler would continue to, because I will tell you, every single journalist who has a book, you'll find a nice David Chandler blurb saying this is really great. So he used it on one journalist that I could see, and that's me. And I will note that I am the only woman journalist who wrote such a book. And that's what I would like to say.
Je vous remercie de ces précisions, mais
Thank you for this clarification, but I'm done with my examination. Thank you.
President, thank you. The time is now good for a short break. We will take a break now and return at 3 o'clock this afternoon. And court officer, please assist the expert during the break and have her return to the courtroom at 3 o'clock. The court is now in recess.
សូមអញ្ជើញក្រោកឈរ